If Dad stops working again to save someone, will you fire him again? Eli Price's voice trembled through the microphone, and the applause inside the packed company auditorium died at once. The 9-year-old gripped the blood-stained sleeve of his father's orange safety vest while Malcolm stood beside him, his hand still inches from the white promotion folder CEO Julia Bennett had offered. Behind them, security footage showed Malcolm carrying a bleeding Tasha Green beneath the frozen time code, 2 hours 17 minutes and 43 seconds. At the edge of the stage, Scott Miller motioned urgently toward the control booth. "Leave the screen alone," Julia said.
Eli swallowed.
"I just need to know." 3 hours earlier, the auditorium had smelled of fresh coffee, electrical dust, and the lemon polish used on the black stage floor. Technicians tested the microphones while rows of employees filed into folding chairs, speaking in low voices whenever Malcolm passed. He wore a clean navy work shirt beneath the same orange vest the company had returned with his belongings. The dark brown stain across its chest had survived 2 washes. Eli had asked him not to scrub it again. "It proves you didn't leave for nothing," the boy had said. Malcolm had not corrected him. At 40, he had learned that children sometimes held truth more carefully than adults did. He simply zipped Eli's blue jacket, checked that the boy's shoelaces were tied, and led him toward 2 seats near the aisle. Julia approached without cameras following her. Her gray suit was severe, but her expression was not. She carried the white folder against her ribs as if it weighed more than paper should. "Mr. Price, the board has approved the offer," she said. "Today, everyone will hear what actually happened." Malcolm looked past her toward the stage, where Scott stood beside Nancy Caldwell and spoke quietly to the audio supervisor. "Will they hear why it was allowed to happen?" he asked. Julia paused. It was only half a second, but Malcolm saw it. "The investigation will be presented," she answered. It was careful language, corporate language, the kind that could hold an apology without holding responsibility. Malcolm nodded once. "Then let the evidence speak before I do." Eli sat with both hands tucked beneath his thighs, watching workers fill the room. Some smiled at Malcolm. Others looked away, ashamed of having believed the notice posted beside the time clock. "Terminated for job abandonment." No one had written beneath it that Tasha had been losing blood under a collapsed steel frame. No one had written that Malcolm had pressed a cargo strap against her leg while waiting for paramedics. At the control table, a technician loaded the recovered Lane 4 footage. The screen flashed once, filling the auditorium with a grainy view of the shipping floor. Malcolm appeared in the center, running toward Tasha as everyone else stepped back. Eli leaned forward. Julia stopped walking. In the far corner of the image, almost hidden behind a pallet, Scott was bent low beside rack 17. His hand was closing around a small red object near the fallen support beam. "Can you freeze that?" Malcolm asked. The technician hesitated and looked toward Scott. Julia's voice came from behind him. "Freeze it." The picture stopped. Scott straightened too quickly. Nancy lowered her eyes to the policy binder in her hands. Malcolm moved closer to the screen, not angry, not triumphant, only studying the red shape between Scott's fingers. It was small enough to overlook, ordinary enough to throw away, and 6 days before Tasha nearly died, someone had attached that same red service tag to rack 17. The red service tag frozen between Scott Miller's fingers had never appeared in Malcolm Price's termination file. Malcolm stared at the enlarged image until the auditorium lights seemed to fade around it, and the memory of another glass-walled room returned with painful clarity. 3 weeks earlier, that same orange safety vest had rested inside a clear plastic evidence bag beside him while Scott slid a document across a polished conference table. "Sign at the bottom. I need to read it. The decision has already been made." Fluorescent lights hummed above them, too white and too steady, and the air carried the bitter smell of reheated coffee. Through the glass wall, warehouse employees passed in reflective vests, slowing just enough to see Malcolm seated before human resources before quickly lowering their eyes. Nancy Caldwell folded her hands over a leather policy binder. Her voice remained soft, almost maternal. "Mr. Price, We understand this is especially difficult for a single parent. Unfortunately, personal circumstances cannot excuse leaving an assigned station without authorization. Malcolm looked at the bold words near the top of the page. Job abandonment. Beneath them, the report stated that he had left Lane 4 for a personal matter at 2:11 p.m., causing an unauthorized operational shutdown. There was no mention of Tasha beneath the fallen steel. No mention of blood soaking through his vest. No mention of the dispatcher telling him not to release pressure from her leg. She was bleeding, Malcolm said. The medical response is being reviewed separately. I stopped the line because people were still under that rack. That does not change the attendance violation. Nancy spoke each sentence with the patient rhythm of someone explaining a rule to a person she had already decided would not understand it. Jonathan Pierce watched from a monitor at the end of the table, his silver tie sharp against a white shirt. Consistency protects everyone, Mr. Price. Once managers begin making emotional exceptions, standards collapse. Malcolm's fingers rested beside the plastic bag. Through it, he could see the dried brown stain across the orange fabric and the edge of his employee badge still clipped to the chest pocket. He did not raise his voice. A woman nearly died. That isn't an emotional exception. Scott shifted in his chair and tapped the report with one finger. Your responsibility was to secure your station and wait for the designated response team. The designated team was 6 minutes away. You were not authorized to make that judgment. Malcolm looked at him for a long moment. Scott's shirt cuffs were clean. His shoes were clean. Nothing on him suggested he had knelt beside Tasha or touched the steel that trapped her. Nancy turned another page. Your health coverage will remain active through Sunday. Malcolm's eyes moved to her face. My son has an asthma refill due Monday. You may be eligible for continuation coverage. At the full premium? Nancy's silence answered before she did. The information will be mailed to you. Malcolm breathed in slowly through his nose, then reached for the report. A safety checklist had been clipped behind it. Rack A17 was marked inspected and operational, and beside the line was a set of initials. MP Malcolm studied the letters. The shape was close, but the downward stroke on the P leaned left. His never did. This isn't mine. Scott gave a small professional smile. Employees often forget routine paperwork. I don't forget my signature. Initials are not a signature. The room settled into a thin, uncomfortable quiet. Nancy glanced at the checklist for half a second longer than necessary, but she did not remove it from the file. Malcolm pushed the papers back without signing. Preserve the camera footage, the emergency stop log, the 911 recording, and every maintenance record for A17. Scott leaned back. The camera on Lane 4 had already been down for days. Malcolm's hand stopped over the plastic bag. He had not mentioned Lane 4. He had not mentioned any camera at all. Scott seemed to realize it a moment too late and reached for the language of procedure again. That information was included in the preliminary review. Malcolm lifted his employee badge from the bag, turned it once between his fingers, then placed it carefully on top of the unsigned termination form. Then preserved the review too. As he stood, Scott lowered one hand beneath the table and sent a message without looking at his phone. Malcolm could not see the words, but back in the auditorium, with the red tag frozen on the giant screen, he finally understood the question he should have asked that day. If Lane 4's camera had truly been broken, how had Scott known exactly what needed to disappear? The answer began with a sound Malcolm almost ignored. A thin metallic shiver beneath the steady thunder of the shipping floor. 3 weeks earlier, forklifts beeped between painted lanes, conveyor belts rattled beneath fluorescent lights, and the air smelled of cardboard, machine grease, and hot rubber. Malcolm was checking. A damaged pallet when the shiver came again. One wrong note inside a noise he had heard every day for years. He looked toward rack 17. The upper frame trembled. Clear the lane. What? Move. Now. Malcolm dropped the scanner and crossed the yellow line just as a steel brace snapped loose. Boxes shifted overhead. Tasha Green turned at the sound, but the lower support struck her before she could step away, knocking her down and pinning one leg beneath the frame. For one stunned second, everyone froze. Then blood began spreading through the fabric below her knee. Malcolm hit the red emergency stop button with the heel of his hand. The conveyor groaned into silence, leaving only Tasha's broken breathing and the faint ticking of loose metal above her. Call 911. Should we lift it? Nobody touches that rack. He knelt outside the unstable frame, pulled a cargo strap from the nearest cart, and reached beneath the steel without shifting its weight. Tasha grabbed his wrist hard enough to leave marks. Malcolm, I can't feel my foot. Look at me.
I'm scared.
I know. Keep looking at me. He folded the strap into a thick pad and pressed it above the wound. Tasha cried out, and Malcolm apologized once, quietly, without releasing pressure. His orange vest darkened where her blood touched his chest. A young warehouse worker stood nearby holding a phone with both hands, too shaken to answer the dispatcher. Malcolm gave him the address, the loading entrance, and the condition of the rack, then told him to stay on the line. He did not shame the boy for freezing. He gave him one job he could finish. Near Tasha's boot, something red protruded from beneath the bent support. Malcolm recognized the shape of a maintenance tag, folded backward so its printed side faced the floor. He could see only the code A17 and a date from 6 days earlier before Tasha's hand tightened around his sleeve again. Don't let me pass out. Tell me what you packed for lunch. What? Your lunch. She blinked through tears. Turkey sandwich. What kind of bread? Malcolm, why does that matter? Because you're going to complain about hospital food later, and I need to know what you'll compare it to. Her breath came out as something between a sob and a laugh. He kept talking, asking about mustard, chips, anything ordinary enough to hold her in the room. His phone vibrated against the concrete beside his knee. The screen showed the after-school program calling. Eli had to be picked up soon. Malcolm watched the name flash once, twice, then turned the phone face down and kept pressure on Tasha's leg. Scott Miller arrived after the line had been stopped for nearly 4 minutes. His polished shoes halted outside the marked lane. Why is the entire section down? Rack failure. Where's the response team? Coming. Then get back to your station. Malcolm did not look up. She's losing blood. You are not medically assigned. Neither is the floor. Scott's jaw tightened, though his voice stayed controlled. Every minute this line is stopped costs the facility money. Malcolm checked Tasha's breathing and adjusted the strap by less than an inch. Then start counting after she's safe. The paramedics arrived with a rolling stretcher and stabilization equipment. One of them examined Malcolm's hands and told him not to release pressure until they had secured the wound. When they lifted Tasha, she refused to let go of his sleeve. Malcolm climbed into the ambulance because the medic needed both hands on the brace and asked him to continue pressing the strap during transport. Only then did he grab his phone and call Eli's school. I'm going to be late, he said when the receptionist answered. Please tell my son I didn't forget him. Outside the ambulance, Scott watched the doors close. Then, while the safety team was still approaching and everyone else was looking toward the flashing lights, he stepped beneath the edge of rack 17. He bent down, pulled the red S17 service tag from the fallen brace, and slipped it inside his jacket. A worker across the lane saw only the quick movement and the flash of red, but later, that small act would become the first reason anyone thought to ask what Scott had known before the steel ever fell. By the time Malcolm returned from the hospital, Scott's version of the rescue had already become the official story. Malcolm had abandoned his assigned station, triggered an unnecessary shutdown, and left the facility for a personal reason. Tasha was still recovering under fluorescent hospital lights, but the company had reduced the blood on Malcolm's orange vest to an attendance violation. 2 days after his termination, Malcolm carried his old phone and the clear plastic bag of work clothes into Miguel Alvarez's union office. The room smelled of burnt coffee and printer toner. A ceiling fan clicked every third rotation while Miguel spread 4 documents beneath a green desk lamp. I can challenge the termination. Can you prove what happened? Not yet. Malcolm placed his phone beside the papers and unlocked the voicemail log. He did not accuse Scott. He did not guess. He simply pointed to the first time. The emergency stop system recorded his hand on the red button at 2:09 p.m. The 911 dispatcher answered at 2:11. Malcolm's voicemail to Eli School began at 2:14. His voice strained but controlled as he explained that he was helping an injured coworker and would be late. Tasha's hospital wristband showed an intake time of 2:26. Miguel leaned closer, his glasses catching the desk lamp. Scott's report said Malcolm had left his station for personal reasons at 2:11. The same minute the emergency call began. Malcolm slid the report beneath the light. How could I leave for a personal reason while I was telling 911 how much blood she was losing? The fan clicked once, twice. Miguel stopped writing. One clock can be wrong, he said quietly. For clocks telling the same story is a witness. That afternoon, Malcolm went to the hospital with Tasha's phone, keys, and dented lunch container. He found her sitting upright with her injured leg elevated, the blanket forming a stiff ridge over the brace. The room smelled of antiseptic and overcooked vegetables. Her untouched tray rested near the window. Your turkey sandwich didn't survive, Malcolm said, setting the lunch container on the table. Tasha gave him a tired smile, then looked toward the door before lowering her voice. Scott's people called. Malcolm pulled the visitor's chair closer but did not sit until she nodded. They said my treatment could be reviewed if I made accusations before the investigation is finished. Did they ask you to sign anything? Not yet. Her fingers worried the edge of the hospital band. Malcolm, I know what you did, but I can't lose this coverage. He looked at the metal brace around her leg, then at the fear she was trying to hide. You don't owe me a statement. But they fired you. You need to heal before anyone asks you to fight. He plugged her phone into the wall, placed the keys where she could reach them, and folded the plastic grocery bag beneath the table so a nurse would not trip over it. There was no camera in the room, no executive watching, only Tasha's breathing easing by a fraction because he had not turned her gratitude into a debt. Across town, Miguel's evidence preservation request reached Julia Bennett's office. Julia read Scott's report first. It was clean, chronological, and professionally written. It also carried Malcolm's disputed initials on the safety checklist. She had no reason yet to assume the branch manager was lying, and Malcolm's decision to leave with the ambulance had plainly violated procedure. Still, the 4 timestamps bothered her. She asked legal counsel to prevent automatic deletion of the Lane 4 data while the records were reviewed. Scott responded within 12 minutes. His first report had said the Lane 4 camera had been broken for days. His new email said the camera had captured nothing of value. Julia read both sentences twice. Then she called Scott. Was the camera broken? Functionally, yes. That wasn't my question. A pause passed over the line, faint but measurable. Scott recovered quickly, explaining that the camera sometimes transmitted corrupted files and that Malcolm was using routine technical problems to distract from a clear attendance violation. His tone remained calm, concerned, almost protective of the company. But when Julia asked whether any file had reached the backup server, Scott answered too fast. There was nothing worth preserving. Julia looked through the glass wall of her office at the city lights beginning to appear below. She had not asked whether the footage was worth preserving. She had asked whether it existed. That evening, the IT director called her privately. Lane 4's folder was empty, but the server log showed that a video file had been moved, renamed, and marked non-reportable less than an hour after the ambulance left. The file marked non-reportable had been moved with Scott Miller's management credentials, but Julia Bennett did not open it yet. She ordered IT to create a sealed copy, preserve the server log, and tell no one outside legal that the file had been found. The next morning, Nancy Caldwell invited Malcolm to what she called a private resolution meeting. The conference room was smaller than the one where he had been fired. Rain pressed softly against the windows, and a recording device supplied by the union sat in the center of the table, its red light steady beneath the hum of the air conditioner. Miguel Alvarez took the chair beside Malcolm. Nancy placed a white envelope between them. 6 months of severance. What else? Temporary health coverage for Eli. Malcolm's eyes rested on the envelope. Eli's inhaler refill was due in 4 days. The rent notice on Malcolm's kitchen counter had been folded beneath a grocery receipt, so the boy would not see it. Nancy slid a second document forward with both palms, careful and sympathetic. We can also provide a positive employment reference. No admission of misconduct from either side. You sign today, and your family has room to breathe. Malcolm read the first page slowly. The words were clean, legal, almost gentle. Then he reached the paragraph near the bottom. Personal departure unrelated to workplace conditions. He read it twice. This says the accident had nothing to do with why I left. It says the parties disagree about the circumstances.
No.
It says I left for a personal reason. Nancy folded her hands. Mr. Price, this language allows everyone to move forward without damaging reputations. Malcolm looked toward Miguel, who remained silent. This was Malcolm's decision. What happens to Tasha's claim if I sign this? Nancy's expression barely changed. Her medical case is separate. Is it? We are here to discuss your termination. Malcolm placed one finger beneath the clause. If I say I left for a personal reason, the company can say her injury didn't require me to leave. Then her treatment becomes easier to deny. The rain ticked against the glass. Somewhere beyond the wall, a chair scraped across tile and stopped. Nancy lowered her voice. Your son should not lose stability because you are trying to solve another employee's case. Malcolm looked again at the white envelope. For one quiet second, his hand moved toward it. Then he pushed both the envelope and the agreement back across the table. I need insurance for my son, he said. I don't need it paid for with another worker's silence. Nancy exhaled slowly, still wearing the expression of someone trying to help an unreasonable man. Please do not misunderstand compassion as pressure. Then change the sentence. The language is standard. So was the report that called saving her a personal errand. The red light on the recorder did not blink. It simply continued holding every word. Nancy reached for the papers, but Malcolm placed his palm lightly over the final page before she could remove it. Leave the copy with Miguel. These terms are confidential. The meeting is recorded under the union agreement. Her hand stopped. At that moment, Scott entered without knocking. His tie was slightly crooked, though his voice remained smooth. I was told we were close to resolving this. Nancy gave him a warning glance. Malcolm lifted his hand from the agreement. We were discussing whether Tasha's injury was related to my leaving. Scott's mouth tightened. The clip does not show what happened before she fell. No one answered. The air conditioner suddenly sounded much louder. Miguel's pen stopped above his notebook. Nancy slowly lowered her hand from the policy folder. Scott looked from one face to another, realizing too late what he had admitted. Malcolm did not accuse him. He asked only one question. What clip? Scott recovered quickly. I meant any potential footage. Hypothetically. You said the clip. Do not turn ordinary language into an allegation. Behind the mirrored observation glass, Julia listened to the live union feed with General Counsel beside her. She looked down at the copied server log, then sent a message to IT. Preserve every version, every access record, every backup. Do not notify branch management. Malcolm gathered nothing from the table except his worn phone. Before leaving, he glanced once at the white envelope that could have protected Eli for 6 months. Then he held the door open for Miguel and walked out without it. 40 minutes later, IT confirmed that the Lane 4 video had been renamed NR 421 and marked non-reportable at 3:08 p.m. on the day of the accident. The account belonged to Scott, but the access history showed the file had been opened again from a second office inside Human Resources. The second access point belonged to Nancy Caldwell's office. At 4:12 p.m., more than an hour after Scott renamed the Lane 4 video, someone inside Human Resources had opened the file, viewed it for 11 minutes, and closed it without restoring it to the safety record. Julia Bennett ordered IT to seal both access logs before she watched the footage herself. The conference room lights were dimmed, leaving the monitor's pale glow across the faces of Julia, Miguel Alvarez, General Counsel, and an independent systems analyst. At 2:09, Malcolm appeared on-screen turning toward rack 17 before anyone else reacted. He hit the emergency stop, cleared the lane, knelt beside Tasha, and pressed a cargo strap against her leg. The 911 recording played beside the footage. "Do not release pressure," the dispatcher instructed. "Paramedics are 4 minutes out." The video showed Malcolm obeying every direction. It also showed Scott arriving, checking the stalled conveyor, and bending near the fallen support while the paramedics lifted Tasha. His hand closed around the red A-17 service tag. He placed it inside his jacket. No one in the conference room spoke. The printer near the wall finished a page, clicked once, then fell silent. Julia watched Scott leave the frame and asked the analyst to replay those 7 seconds. Again. Ms. Bennett. Again. On the third viewing, the red tag was impossible to mistake. By noon, an outside maintenance company had confirmed that A-17 was not debris from the accident. Its invoice showed rack 17 had been flagged 6 days earlier for a cracked locking joint. The recommended repair had been postponed until the following week. A badge access report placed Scott inside the safety records room at 2:41 on the day of the accident. 6 minutes later, the first job abandonment report against Malcolm was created from a computer in Scott's office. At that moment, Malcolm was still at the hospital, his hands stained with Tasha's blood. The safety checklist carrying Malcolm's initials became the next problem. A document examiner enlarged the letters on screen. The M and P matched an older form Malcolm had signed months before, not because he had written them twice, but because the pixels were identical. Someone had copied the image of his initials and pasted it onto the new checklist. The file history traced the document back to Scott's office computer. Julia asked Malcolm to come in that afternoon. He entered wearing a plain navy shirt, his old phone in one hand and the clear bag containing the orange vest in the other. He did not look toward the empty chair reserved for Scott. He looked first at the footage paused on Tasha's face. Has her treatment been restored? Julia had prepared to discuss his termination. The question made her close the folder in front of her. Her medical coverage was reinstated this morning, retroactively. And her wages while she recovers? That is being corrected. Malcolm nodded once. Then we can talk about me. Julia showed him the video, the maintenance invoice, the badge log, and the copied initials. Malcolm watched without satisfaction. When Scott's hand took the red tag, his jaw tightened, but his voice remained low. Tasha reported that rack before it fell. We are verifying that, Julia said. Do not announce anything until every record is authenticated. Malcolm looked at her. I'm not asking for an announcement. I'm asking you not to make her carry this alone. Julia studied him differently then. Not as a terminated employee. Not as a struggling father who might need mercy. As a man who had been offered evidence powerful enough to destroy someone and had immediately used it to protect the injured worker instead. Outside the room, Nancy's email reached Julia's phone. It recommended treating Scott as a rogue manager, terminating him quietly, restoring Malcolm's position, and closing the matter before it caused wider reputational damage. The message would have sounded responsible if Nancy's own signature had not been on the order ending Malcolm and Eli's health coverage. An order issued before the accident investigation had even begun. A second notification followed. Jonathan Pierce wanted Julia on a private board call. His voice was controlled when she joined. Remove Scott. Compensate the worker. Bring Price back if necessary. But there is no reason to expose the company to a public spectacle. The records were altered by a branch manager. Human Resources accessed the hidden footage. Jonathan's pause lasted just long enough to change the room. Then handle Human Resources. And the safety ledger? Julia asked. What about it? She opened the archived email the outside investigator had recovered. Jonathan's name appeared above a single sentence sent the evening of the accident. Keep the incident off the safety ledger until after earnings. In the dark glass of the conference room, Julia could see her own reflection staring back at her, the email glowing between Malcolm's blood-stained vest and the forged safety form. This was no longer one manager protecting a productivity score or one HR director hiding a bad decision. The lie had climbed from the warehouse floor into the boardroom, and the truth had become too heavy to keep behind a closed door. The company auditorium had been arranged like a place for celebration, but no one inside it looked ready to celebrate. Rows of folding chairs faced a black stage beneath cold white lights, and beyond the glass wall at the rear of the room, the shipping floor stretched toward Rack 17. Malcolm Price entered through the side doors with Eli beside him. The boy's small hand closed around the sleeve of the orange safety vest his father carried over one arm. Workers shifted in their seats as Malcolm passed. Some nodded. Some stared at the floor. Scott Miller stood near the stage in a pressed charcoal suit. Nancy Caldwell held a thick policy binder against her chest, and Jonathan Pierce appeared on the center screen from a boardroom 3 states away. Julia Bennett waited behind the podium but did not begin with the prepared statement glowing on the teleprompter. She looked at Malcolm, then at the employees who had watched him leave the building 3 weeks earlier with his belongings in a clear plastic bag. "This meeting will follow the evidence," she said. "Each person named will be given a chance to respond." "This should have been handled privately," Jonathan said through the speakers. "It was handled privately," Julia replied. "That is how it became this." The first image on the screen was Malcolm's orange vest, photographed after the accident. The dark stain across its chest drew the room into silence before the recovered lane for footage began to play. At 2:09, Malcolm turned toward the unstable rack. At 2:11, the 911 call started. At 2:14, his voicemail reached Eli's school. At 2:17, he was still kneeling beside Tasha, pressing the cargo strap against her leg. Scott stepped toward the microphone. His voice remained calm. "No one disputes that Mr. Price assisted Ms. Green. The issue was whether he followed the required chain of command afterward." A few managers in the front row exchanged glances. For one moment, his explanation seemed to restore order. Malcolm had left the property. He had entered the ambulance. Procedure had been broken. Scott continued, "A company of this size cannot allow every employee to decide which rules apply during a stressful event." Malcolm did not interrupt. He laid the blood-stained vest on the evidence table and smoothed one folded edge with his palm. Julia brought up the emergency stop log beside the 911 transcript. "Mr. Price," she said, "why did you leave the facility?" "The paramedic needed me to keep pressure on her leg." "Did you decide that yourself?" "No." Malcolm looked toward the screen. "It's on the recording." The dispatcher's voice filled the auditorium, followed by the medic instructing Malcolm not to release the strap during transport. Scott's explanation did not disappear, but it weakened. A chair in the second row stopped scraping. Nancy shifted the binder higher against her chest. Then Julia displayed the red service tag marked A17. Scott's expression barely changed. "That tag was not secured through proper chain of custody," he said. "It could have been placed near the rack after the failure." The room stirred again. It was a plausible objection, and Scott knew it. Jonathan leaned closer to his camera. "That alone cannot establish prior knowledge." Julia did not answer immediately. She displayed the maintenance invoice dated 6 days before the accident, then the inspection photograph showing the same tag attached to Rack 17. Scott's jaw tightened. "Maintenance recommendations are not automatic shutdown orders." "No," Malcolm said. His voice was quiet enough that the room had to lean toward him. "But they are not trash either." Julia added the email ordering the repair delayed until after the quarterly shipping target. The sender was Scott. The room's attention moved from Malcolm to the branch manager. Scott touched the knot of his tie. "That delay was based on the information available at the time." "Then why remove the tag?" Julia asked. He turned toward her. "I did not." The footage resumed. At 2:16, while paramedics worked around Tasha, Scott bent beside the support beam and placed the red tag inside his jacket. A low sound passed through the audience. Not quite a gasp and not yet anger. Scott lifted one hand. "The video angle is misleading. I may have been clearing loose material from the emergency area." "That is possible," Julia said. which is why we did not rely on the video alone. Tasha Green entered from the side aisle with a cane in one hand and Miguel Alvarez beside her. Malcolm moved instinctively as if to help, but stopped when Tasha gave him a small nod and took the final steps on her own. She placed a printed email on the table. "I reported a 17 6 days before it fell," she said. "The system sent me this confirmation." Julia projected the email header, the service request number, and the maintenance invoice with the same code. Scott looked toward Nancy. Nancy looked down. Malcolm did not smile. He watched Tasha lower herself carefully into a chair, then moved the water bottle closer to her reach. Julia continued through the badge log showing Scott entering the safety room at 2:41, the job abandonment report created at 2:47, and the forged checklist carrying Malcolm's copied initials. Nancy finally stepped forward. Human Resources relied on documentation supplied by branch management. Once concerns arose, we pursued a resolution intended to protect Mr. Price and his child. Miguel activated the recording from the private mediation. Nancy's own voice filled the auditorium, offering Eli temporary insurance if Malcolm signed language that could have damaged Tasha's medical claim. Her face lost color, but her posture remained rigid. That proposal was standard settlement practice. Malcolm looked at her across the table. "Standard does not mean harmless." Jonathan interrupted from the screen. "We are losing perspective. The company has already corrected the employment decision. Continuing this spectacle threatens thousands of workers who had nothing to do with the incident." Julia turned toward his image. "You are right about one thing. This is larger than one termination." The final email appeared behind her. "Keep the incident off the safety ledger until after earnings." Jonathan's name and timestamp stood above the sentence. No one whispered now. Malcolm rested one hand on the back of Eli's chair. "I didn't come here to watch 3 people lose their jobs," he said. "I came so the truth would stop losing." Julia closed the prepared speech on the teleprompter, lifted a white appointment folder from the podium, and asked Malcolm to join her at center stage. He walked forward without touching the vest, the tag, or the evidence that had cleared his name. As Julia extended the folder toward him, Eli looked at the frozen image of his father carrying Tasha, tightened his fingers around the orange sleeve, and slowly reached for the microphone. "If Dad stops working again to save someone, will you fire him again?" Eli's question traveled through the microphone and emptied the auditorium of sound. Julia Bennett's hand remained extended, the white appointment folder suspended. Between her and Malcolm, behind them, the recovered Lane 4 footage was frozen at 2 hours 17 minutes and 43 seconds, showing Malcolm carrying Tasha beneath the warehouse lights, his orange vest dark with her blood. On the evidence table, the red A-17 service tag rested beside that same vest. For several seconds, no one moved. The projector fan whispered above the stage. A pen slipped from Nancy Caldwell's fingers and struck the floor with a small plastic click. Scott Miller stared toward the control booth, but no technician reached for the screen. Jonathan Pierce's image remained on the center monitor, his mouth slightly open beneath the email ordering the accident kept off the safety ledger. Eli tightened his grip on his father's sleeve. "I know you want Dad back," he said, his voice smaller now. "I'm asking if you want him to stay good." Malcolm placed one steady hand over his son's. He did not look at Scott, Nancy, or Jonathan. He looked at Julia. The CEO slowly lowered the appointment folder. "Eli," she said, "I prepared to give your father his job back. I did not prepare an answer that protected the next father." A breath moved through the crowd, then disappeared. Julia turned toward the company's general counsel and Miguel Alvarez. "Put the emergency directive on the screen." A draft policy replaced Jonathan's email. It promised protection for employees who responded to workplace emergencies, but Malcolm read the first paragraph and shook his head. "It says the emergency must be confirmed by the employee's direct manager." Julia looked at the wording. Malcolm nodded toward Scott. "What happens when the manager is the person hiding the emergency?" No one answered. He spoke without anger. "Don't make me the exception. Make saving someone part of the rule." Julia called legal counsel, Miguel, and the independent safety investigator to the evidence table. Before hundreds of employees, they revised the directive line by line. A worker performing a reasonable emergency response would be protected without a supervisor's approval. Health coverage could not be canceled while an incident was under investigation. Camera footage, access logs, safety records, and maintenance files would be automatically preserved. Retaliation against witnesses, injured workers, caregivers, or employees reporting hazards would trigger an independent review. A union representative would sit on every serious safety investigation. The temporary directive would take effect immediately across the company, and the board would have 30 days to adopt the permanent policy publicly. Julia signed first. Miguel signed as labor representative. General counsel signed beneath them. The scratch of each pen sounded unusually loud. Then Julia faced the room. Scott's employment was terminated for falsifying records, removing safety evidence, and interfering with an investigation. Nancy was suspended, stripped of authority over employee benefits, and referred to an outside review for her role in accessing the hidden footage and using Eli's insurance as pressure. Jonathan was removed from the Safety Oversight Committee, and the recovered records would be forwarded to the appropriate workplace safety and legal authorities. No one applauded. The consequences were too serious for celebration. Scott's hand rested against the back of a chair, as if he needed it to remain standing. Nancy closed her policy binder but could not meet Malcolm's eyes. Jonathan's video feed went dark after the board secretary ended his access to the meeting. Julia restored Tasha's medical coverage, rehabilitation wages, and employment protections in writing. She ordered Malcolm's job abandonment record erased, his lost pay returned, and every external employment reference corrected. Only then did she offer him the white folder again. Malcolm looked at Tasha, standing with her cane beside the evidence table. He looked down at Eli. Then he accepted the folder with one hand, not as a gift, and not as payment for silence. "I'll take the position when this directive reaches every facility," he said, "and when the people who report danger know their families will still have insurance the next morning." "Agreed," Julia said. This time the applause began slowly, not for the promotion, but for the rule that would outlast the stage. Eli did not clap. He leaned close to Malcolm and whispered, "Does this mean they believe you now?" Malcolm looked at the signed directive, the blood-stained vest, and the frozen image of the moment he had chosen a life over a rule. The truth had finally been recognized, but his son was still waiting to learn what recognition could heal, and what Malcolm would choose to do with the power now placed in his hands. The applause faded before the auditorium emptied. Employees moved past the evidence table in quiet lines, their shoes whispering over the black floor while technicians lowered the lights. Scott left with an outside investigator beside him. Nancy surrendered her access badge and policy binder to legal counsel. On the center screen, Jonathan Pierce's name had disappeared, replaced by a notice that the board had opened an independent review. Malcolm remained near the stage with Eli's hand inside his own. The white appointment folder rested beneath his arm, but he did not open it. Tasha stood beside the table, leaning lightly on her cane as Julia Bennett handed her written confirmation that her medical care, rehabilitation wages, and job protections had been restored. "You reported the danger before the accident," Julia said. "The record will say that clearly." Tasha looked at the red A-17 service tag, then at the scar beneath the edge of her brace. "I want the next report to matter before somebody gets hurt." "It will," Julia answered, "and you will have a voice in making sure it does." 3 months later, Rack 17 had been removed. The shipping floor had new inspection lights, and every safety warning entered the system produced a receipt that could not be deleted by branch management. The emergency response and caregiver protection policy had been approved across the company. Employee insurance remained active during investigations. Camera footage and access logs were preserved automatically. Workers who stopped production to provide reasonable emergency help could no longer be disciplined without an independent review. Malcolm returned only after the final policy appeared on every facility bulletin board. On his first morning as Regional Safety and Worker Care Manager, he entered the same building that had once taken his badge. He wore a plain navy shirt, work boots, and the steel watch that had belonged to his father. He carried the old orange vest in a clear garment bag. The blood stain had faded at the edges, but it had not disappeared. Malcolm hung it over the back of a chair in the training room and placed a copy of the A-17 service tag beside it. "This isn't a trophy," he told the supervisors seated before him. "It's what happens when a warning is treated like an inconvenience." He did not mention Scott by name. He did not ask anyone to applaud. He walked them through emergency response, evidence preservation, and the duty to protect the person who reports danger. When Julia offered to name the new policy after him, Malcolm declined. "People should not need my name to be allowed to do the right thing." Tasha returned on limited duty after completing physical therapy. She did not come back as the injured woman everyone whispered about. She joined the training team and showed workers how to recognize stress fractures, missing tags, and altered inspection records. Her first lesson began with the email she had sent 6 days before the accident. This time, no one dismissed it as routine paperwork. One afternoon, an employee at another facility collapsed beside a conveyor. A coworker hit the emergency stop, stayed with him, and called for help. The supervisor preserved the footage, protected the worker's shift record, and contacted his family before the ambulance left. Malcolm read the incident report twice. No one had been punished. No evidence had disappeared. The policy had worked without a CEO, a public meeting, or a child holding a microphone. That evening, Julia joined Malcolm and Eli near the employee entrance. She wore safety shoes instead of heels and carried no folder. "I owe both of you more than one apology," she said. Malcolm looked at Eli before answering. "An apology matters when the work after it matches the words." Julia nodded. She did not ask for forgiveness. She only promised to keep showing the work. At the bus stop, Eli sat beside his father with his backpack between his sneakers. The orange vest was folded on Malcolm's lap, no longer evidence in a termination case, but a reminder that protection had once begun with one person refusing to step away. "Did my question fix everything?" Eli asked. Malcolm knelt and retied the boy's loose shoelace.
No.
"The truth fixed part of it. People taking responsibility fixed the rest. And if it happens again?" Malcolm looked through the shelter glass at the warehouse lights glowing across the road. "Then the next person won't stand alone." The bus arrived with a soft hiss. For a moment, father and son remained still, listening to the ordinary sound of doors opening. Malcolm folded the vest once more and followed Eli aboard, carrying no anger that needed an audience, only the quiet proof that dignity does not have to shout for kindness to become justice.